Forget storybooks and noble knights. If you were a child in the Middle Ages, school meant pain, fear, and obedience. You weren't taught to think, you were taught to survive. Latin was beaten into your bones, questions were punishable, and the rod was never far. Behind the stone walls of monastic classrooms and cathedral schools, a quiet war was being waged, not against ignorance, but against childhood itself. This is the forgotten story of how medieval education broke minds to build obedience. In the Middle Ages, childhood as we understand it today, a protected phase of innocence and learning, simply didn't exist. For most of medieval Europe, a child was considered a half-formed adult, a body to be trained, corrected, and prepared for labor or obedience as early as possible. There was no sentimental view of childhood development, no widespread concept of nurturing growth through curiosity or emotional support. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to mirror the roles, attitudes, and labor of adults around them by age 7. A child was no longer a toddler. They were expected to take on responsibilities that could determine the course of their lives. For peasant children, this meant rising before dawn to tend livestock, gather firewood, or follow their parents into the fields. Their hands became calloused before they could even spell their own names. In rural villages, schooling was rare and often irrelevant. Survival came first. Learning, if it happened, was through watching, imitating, and enduring. But hardship wasn't limited to the lower classes. Among the nobility, children faced a different kind of rigor, one rooted in social hierarchy and calculated discipline. A noble boy might be removed from his household at 7 to become a page in another lord's court, beginning a strict regimen of military training, etiquette, and subordination. A girl, meanwhile, was often groomed for marriage, with instruction centered on piety, chastity, and obedience. Her body and future often treated as assets in political or economic alliances. For some children, particularly boys from families with religious aspirations or limited means, another fate awaited: the monastery. This wasn't necessarily a punishment. Monasteries offered food, structure, and status, but the cost was steep. Children as young as 6 or 7 were entrusted to monks who would raise them according to the rule of Saint Benedict or other rigid orders. The moment they crossed the threshold of the cloister, their identities began to erode. Life inside a medieval monastery was governed by silence, routine, and submission. Days began before sunrise with prayer and ended in darkness with more of the same. Young oblates, as these children were called, were expected to memorize liturgical texts, often in Latin, a language they didn't speak. Any mistake, any sign of inattentiveness, was met with swift and sometimes harsh correction. These boys were not being raised as children, but as future monks, expected to shed their individual will, abandon worldly attachments, and internalize a lifelong discipline most adults would struggle to endure. There was no room for questioning, no encouragement of wonder. Education in this context was not a gateway to understanding, but a tool for conformity. Whether in a monastery manor, house, or peasant cottage, medieval education rarely sought to inspire. It sought to shape, to produce servants of God, of lords, or of labor. In every case, the child's voice, if it was ever heard, was subdued beneath layers of authority, ritual, and necessity. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to be hurried toward adulthood with little protection from the physical or emotional toll. Before a mind could fully form, it was already being molded, often by forces indifferent to its well-being. By the early Middle Ages, monasteries had become not just centers of religious devotion, but the few remaining repositories of learning in Western Europe. And within their high stone walls, a different kind of education was unfolding, one built not on creativity or exploration, but on repetition, silence, and submission. Children sent to monastic schools were usually between 6 and 10 years old. Some were given by parents in the hope of securing spiritual favor, others because it relieved economic pressure. The boys, known as oblati, were dedicated to monastic life before they were capable of understanding what it meant. Once accepted, they were stripped of worldly clothing, often had their heads tonsured in the monastic style, and began a lifelong process of transformation from child to monk, from individual to servant of God, inside the monastic classroom. Conditions were austere. Walls were built from rough-cut stone, rarely warmed in winter. The only furnishings were narrow wooden benches, writing tables, and shelves for precious manuscripts. Heating was minimal, and lighting came from narrow windows or flickering oil lamps. Instruction took place in a climate of strict silence. Speaking without permission could result in penance or corporal punishment. Communication among students was often restricted to sign language approved by the order. The daily routine was rigid. The day began long before dawn with matins, the first of 8 canonical hours of prayer. From there, the boys moved between religious services and instruction, interspersed with manual labor and sparse meals. Breakfast was uncommon. Fasting was frequent. Even young students were expected to internalize the monastic rhythm of self-denial. The core of monastic education was the mastery of Latin, not as a spoken language, but as the language of scripture, liturgy, and learning. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the trivium, formed the foundation, but comprehension wasn't always the goal. Boys were drilled to recite vast sections of texts, especially the Psalms, with perfect accuracy. Memorization was considered a virtue. Questioning was not. Much of the academic work centered around copying manuscripts. The scriptorium, the writing chamber, was both a workshop and a classroom. Boys learned to handle ink, sharpen quills, and write in the formal scripts used in religious texts. A single mistake in transcription could mean hours of correction or punishment. The copying of texts was treated not only as a scholarly task, but as a spiritual discipline, through repetition, obedience, and silence. Students were meant to train both hand and soul. Corporal punishment was not only common, but institutionalized. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic orders, permitted chastisement at a suitable time, with moderation. Though what counted as moderation was subjective, discipline was meant to crush pride and instill humility. Disobedience, even inattentiveness, could bring swift correction, physical or spiritual. The psychological effects of this environment were significant. Many oblates experienced profound loneliness and confusion. Few had contact with their families after entering the monastery. Emotional expression was suppressed. Childhood, as a space for social learning or affection, was effectively suspended. Some grew into devout and disciplined monks. Others left the cloister at the first opportunity, broken or disillusioned. Monastic schools preserved classical knowledge through the darkest centuries of medieval Europe. They were the forerunners of the university, the guardians of Latin literacy, and the scribes of Christian Europe. But for the children who lived within their stone enclosures, education came at a price, one paid not in curiosity and joy, but in obedience, silence, and submission to a life they never chose. In medieval classrooms, language was both a tool and a weapon. At the heart of all formal education stood Latin, the language of the church, the courts, and intellectual life. But for most children, it was a foreign tongue. They were expected to speak it, read it, write it, and think in it long before they understood it. Learning Latin was not a gentle process of discovery. It was an exercise in survival. From as early as the 9th century, Latin grammar instruction revolved around a handful of core texts. Chief among them was the Ars Minor of Aelius Donatus, 4th century Roman grammarian whose terse and systematic manual became the backbone of instruction for centuries. Children were drilled relentlessly. Donatus, quid est nomen, Donatus, what is a noun? Pars, orationis, come. Casu, a part of speech with case. These exchanges weren't learned through explanation, but by brute memorization. Understanding came second, if it came at all, by the 11th century. Another text had joined Donatus at the center of medieval grammar, the Institutiones Grammaticae of Priscian, a Byzantine scholar whose work stretched to over 18 books of grammatical commentary. In cathedral schools and grammar schools across Europe, boys were required to commit vast sections of these Latin treatises to memory, reciting them aloud before their masters. Errors were common. Punishment was expected. Corporal discipline was not just tolerated, it was considered essential. Medieval educators believed that learning required physical correction. The rod, the birch, or the ferula, a flat leather strap were standard tools of the schoolroom. One 12th century English monk, Alexander of Neckham, wrote approvingly that a teacher must mingle correction with instruction, and with threats arouse the slothful to study. He was not alone in his De Disciplina Scholarium. The 13th century theologian Vincent of Beauvais advised that boys must be beaten, for fear of being corrupted by idleness or insolence. Even Thomas Aquinas, while more moderate in tone, accepted corporal punishment as part of the educational process. The belief was simple: the body must be disciplined for the mind to be shaped. The consequences of failure were visible and immediate. If a boy stumbled over a conjugation or mispronounced a Latin passage, he might be ordered to his knees on cold stone floors, struck across the hands, or flogged before his peers. The shame was public, the pain was formative. Some teachers were known for cruelty, others simply saw no other method. In a world where obedience was virtue, fear was a form of instruction. Grammar schools, especially in urban centers like London, Paris, or Cologne, developed reputations as places of intense suffering and high expectation. They were feeder institutions for cathedral chapters, chancelleries, and universities, but only for those who endured. For many, the experience was brutal. Few left unscathed. One of the rare surviving schoolboy complaints comes from the 10th century colloquy of Gleifric, where a fictional student describes being beaten daily for failing to recite. The text was written as a teaching tool, but its reflection of the classroom atmosphere is telling. "I am afraid to speak," the boy says, "because of the beatings." In theory, this punishment was meant to produce discipline. In practice, it created fear. Yet for medieval educators, this was not a flaw, it was the point. Through rote repetition and physical correction, students were molded into obedient scribes, clerks, or clergy. Latin was not just a language, it was a gatekeeper, and the path through it was paved with pain. In the medieval world, discipline was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as virtue. Education, like faith, was grounded in the suppression of the self, and fear was its most effective instrument. The dominant philosophy behind medieval teaching methods was inseparable from the religious worldview of the time. Sin was not merely a moral failure, it was an ever-present danger that could damn the soul for eternity. In this context, fear of punishment wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. The child who feared his master was thought to be more likely to fear God. Obedience, humility, and suffering were treated as moral goods, necessary to curb the pride and willfulness believed to be innate in every child. This philosophy extended into the classroom. Teachers, many of them clerics, viewed education as an extension of spiritual formation. Discipline was used to instill order, submission, and moral restraint. In their eyes, the rod did not merely correct behavior, it protected the soul. The physical methods used were as varied as they were severe. Flogging was widespread. Wooden canes, leather straps, and birch branches were kept within reach in nearly every grammar school. Students might be struck on the hands, legs, or buttocks, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private. The ferula, a flat piece of leather or wood, was especially common in ecclesiastical schools. Other punishments included kneeling on sharp stones or coarse grains, designed to inflict pain slowly over time. In some cases, children were tied to whipping posts for extended beatings. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and forced fasting were also used, especially in monastic environments. There was little distinction between corporal punishment for academic failure and punishment for moral infractions. Both were seen as part of a single corrective process. Theologians and educators defended these practices in writing. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, permitted the use of moderate punishment to correct disobedience. A 13th century educational manual advised that as wax is molded by heat, so the child's mind must be shaped by fear. The concept of childhood trauma as we understand it today did not exist. But cracks in the system were noted even in the Middle Ages. John of Salisbury, writing in the 12th century, criticized the excessive violence of some teachers, warning that it could produce resentment instead of virtue. Yet even he conceded that a little fear is salutary. Children, of course, had no power to protest. Few left written records, and most who endured the system did not question it, either because they internalized it or because they knew no alternative. But the long-term effects were not invisible. Chronic fear, psychological withdrawal, and learned helplessness appear again and again in accounts from former students who went on to write about their education. Later in life, the idea that learning required suffering would persist for centuries. Medieval discipline was not an accidental cruelty. It was deliberate, institutionalized, and widely accepted. It created generations of children who could recite, copy, and obey, but rarely question. And in that silence, fear did its work. In the medieval classroom, the teacher was not a guide or mentor. He was a figure of absolute authority, feared more often than respected. The medieval schoolmaster wielded power in the form of language, memory, and physical punishment. His word was law, and his tools, the rod, the ferula, the whip, were rarely out of reach. Schoolmasters were drawn from the clergy or trained in cathedral or monastic schools. Their qualifications varied widely. Some were highly literate in Latin and theology, others little more than functionaries trained in rote instruction. They were often poorly paid and socially marginal. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 noted complaints that teachers earned less than field labourers. Many supplemented their meager incomes by taking in students as boarders or charging fees for individual lessons. But the lack of regulation gave many masters unchecked control. Corporal punishment was both expected and accepted. A passage from the Colloquy of Gleifrich in the 10th century shows a student saying, "I dare not speak for fear of a beating." The sentiment was widespread. In cathedral schools, discipline was often administered publicly, meant to humiliate as well as correct. Boys were whipped for lateness, poor recitation, or even for the failure to maintain silence. The educational system lacked central oversight. Outside a few well-regarded schools, such as those in Paris, Oxford, or Bologna, local parish or town schools operated with near-total autonomy. This inconsistency meant that while some students studied under relatively humane conditions, others endured near-constant brutality. In many cases, the difference came down to the temperament of the master. Some names stand out in contrast. Alcuin of York, the 8th century scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, advocated for a more compassionate approach. In his letters, he warned against using beatings to enforce learning, urging that the minds of children are not to be driven by fear, but drawn by love. But his advice was rarely heeded. The dominant attitude favored severity over sympathy. Centuries later, during the early Renaissance, Erasmus of Rotterdam would echo similar concerns. In On the Education of a Christian Prince, 1516, he criticized the cruelty of grammar school masters, calling for a system based on encouragement rather than terror. Yet Erasmus himself had endured a childhood of beatings in a monastic school and carried the memory into adulthood. Some schoolmasters became infamous for their harshness. John Brinsley, a 17th century English educator, was known for his strict enforcement of Latin drills with the rod in hand. Earlier records from 14th century England mention a teacher in Beverley who was removed from his post for beating a student so severely the boy was unable to walk for days. Incidents like these were not exceptional, they were systemic. Despite the range in quality and methods, cruelty remained a common denominator. In an era where discipline was equated with learning, the schoolmaster's violence was not seen as excess, it was seen as duty. A good teacher, by medieval standards, was not one who inspired thought, but one who ensured silence, obedience, and rote perfection. The rod, not the word, shaped the medieval mind. In medieval Europe, education was a privileged one, reserved almost entirely for boys. Girls, for the most part, remained in the shadows of the intellectual world, their learning confined to what was necessary for a life of obedience, silence, and service. Among peasant families, the idea of formal schooling for girls was nearly non-existent. From early childhood, girls were expected to contribute to household labor, cooking, spinning, tending animals, and preparing for marriage. Instruction came through imitation, not books. Literacy was rare. Survival, not scholarship, was the priority. But, even among the nobility, where wealth and status could grant boys access to grammar schools or private tutors, girls received a very different kind of education. Daughters of noble families were often taught to read, but not to reason. Instruction, if it came, emphasized religious devotion, courtly manners, and the domestic arts. They might learn prayers in Latin or how to manage a household, but philosophy, logic, and literature were considered unsuitable. Convents offered the closest thing to formal education for girls. Wealthy or aristocratic families frequently sent daughters to nunneries, not always out of spiritual conviction, but sometimes as a means to reduce dowries or secure alliances within the church. Inside the cloister, some girls were taught to read and write, primarily to access religious texts. Psalters, saints, lives, and devotional literature formed the core curriculum. But even in these settings, education served a clear ideological function. It was not designed to develop independent thought, but to cultivate virtue, specifically humility, chastity, and piety. Girls were taught to fear sin, to submit to divine authority, and to model their lives on the Virgin Mary. Obedience was valued above intellect. In many cases, reading and writing were taught solely to reinforce religious conformity. Discipline existed, though it differed from the physical punishments boys endured in grammar schools. In convents and religious schools, punishment was often spiritual or emotional. Girls were chastised not with rods, but with shame. They were taught to examine their conscience daily, confess their faults, and suppress pride. Guilt, not fear of the rod, was the principal tool of control. The fear of female literacy ran deep in medieval society. Reading, especially outside the confines of religious instruction, was seen as a potential threat. In several ecclesiastical writings, literate women were associated with heresy or vanity. The Church viewed unsanctioned knowledge as dangerous, especially when held by women who might challenge male authority. Even Christine de Pizzona, one of the few literate women to write publicly in the 15th century, faced criticism for daring to question the roles assigned to her gender. For most girls, silence and submission defined their intellectual boundaries. Their education, when it existed, was not a doorway to power or knowledge, but a safeguard against both. The idea that a woman might think independently, interpret scripture, or speak in public was not just discouraged. It was condemned. While some noble women and nuns did leave behind manuscripts, letters, or illuminated texts, they were the exception. The overwhelming majority of medieval girls lived and died without ever touching ink or parchment. Their names are lost to history, their voices largely unheard. In medieval Europe, education was not a right. It was a privilege, and one reserved for a narrow slice of society. The vast majority of children, especially those born into peasant families, never saw the inside of a classroom. From a young age, they were pulled into the rhythms of agrarian life. Boys followed their fathers into the fields. Girls helped their mothers manage households. Learning came through labor, not letters. Literacy among peasants remained extremely low throughout the Middle Ages, in most rural areas. The only regular exposure to written language came from the local parish priest reading aloud during Mass. Formal schooling, when available at all, was largely inaccessible. Even if a village had a priest who could teach basic Latin or catechism, few parents could afford to spare their children's labor. For the peasantry, education was impractical and often irrelevant. In stark contrast stood the children of the elite, the sons of nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking clergy. For them, education was a pathway to status, power, and influence, but privilege did not mean comfort. These students entered a system that was rigid, grueling, and often violent. At the first tier stood grammar schools, usually attached to cathedral chapters or monasteries. Boys here were trained in Latin grammar using the same ancient texts, Donatus, Priscian, and Boethius. Instruction was almost entirely based on memorization and recitation. Understanding came second. Brutality was common. The curriculum was narrow, the methods punitive. For those who advanced, Cathedral schools represented the next step. These were elite institutions designed to produce clergy, administrators, and scribes for the church and the crown. Notable examples included the schools at Chartres, Reims, and later, Paris. Students studied the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, followed by the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But even here, the structure emphasized obedience over inquiry. By the 12th century, the rise of universities added a new layer. Bologna, Oxford, and Paris became centers of higher learning, attracting students from across Europe. Yet access was still limited by wealth and social standing. University life demanded years of study and the resources to endure it. Despite the prestige, life for students could be harsh. Dormitories were Spartan, meals were minimal, fines, physical punishments, and public humiliation remained common tools for discipline. Clerical students had it worst. As part of their religious training, they were expected to live under monastic rules, silent meals, fixed prayer schedules, and strict behavioral codes. Even among the elite, intellectual development was shaped less by curiosity and more by conformity. Education served institutional needs, not personal growth. The deeper purpose of this system was not enlightenment, it was control. Church and state both required literate servants who could interpret doctrine, draft legal documents, and preserve order. Education produced functionaries, men conditioned to obey authority, recite tradition, and maintain the hierarchy that defined medieval society. Those who were educated paid for the privilege with submission. Those who were not remained excluded. By birth. In both cases, the system reinforced the same truth. Knowledge was not meant to liberate. It was meant to reinforce the world as it already was. The medieval curriculum was designed not to spark inquiry, but to instill obedience. Education in the Middle Ages was tightly structured around a narrow set of subjects, rooted in classical tradition but stripped of critical engagement. At its core stood the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. But in practice, grammar dominated. Almost everything students began with Latin grammar, the foundation of all formal learning. Not conversation, not expression, but mechanical translation and memorization. The grammar of Donatus and Priscian formed the basis of instruction from the early medieval period well into the Renaissance. Pupils recited definitions, and conjugations in a language they did not speak, all under the constant threat of physical punishment for error. The goal was mastery through repetition, not understanding. Rhetoric, in theory, meant the art of persuasion. But in the medieval classroom, it rarely extended beyond the formulaic structure of letter writing or sermon construction. Students were trained to imitate, not innovate. They copied modeled texts, followed rigid compositional rules, and avoided personal interpretation. The emphasis was on style and structure, not originality or analysis. Logic, the third pillar of the trivium, introduced students to Aristotelian thought, but through a Christian lens. The purpose was not to challenge dogma, but to defend it. In cathedral schools and early universities, logic became a tool of theology, used to bolster church doctrine rather than question it. The dialectical method, famously employed by Peter Abelard in the 12th century, allowed for debate, but only within the tight boundaries of orthodoxy. Beyond the trivium, the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, was reserved for more advanced study and typically limited to elite institutions. Even these subjects were interpreted through a theological framework. Astronomy, for instance, was less about empirical observation and more about understanding the divine order of the cosmos. Music theory was based on mathematical ratios and biblical harmony, not performance or composition. Science, as a discipline, barely existed in its own right. Natural philosophy was filtered through theological doctrine. The writings of classical authors like Galen and Aristotle were copied, revered, and rarely questioned. Experimentation was discouraged. Curiosity, unless it reinforced religious truths, was treated with suspicion. Theology dominated all higher learning. From the 9th century onward, it was the ultimate goal of education, not knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge in service of faith. The Bible, the writings of church fathers like Augustine, and the interpretations of scholastic theologians formed the upper levels of the curriculum. Theological questions were debated with great subtlety, but always within prescribed limits. In every tier of this system, the purpose of learning was not to ask why, but to memorize the how to speak, how to pray, how to reason within the rules. Education reinforced the existing order, the authority of the church, the hierarchy of society, and the discipline of tradition. It taught students to replicate knowledge, not to challenge it. By the late Middle Ages, the foundation of Europe's educational system, rooted in fear, rote memorization, and theological rigidity, began to show cracks. The unquestioned dominance of scholasticism, the reliance on corporal punishment, and the view of children as miniature adults came under increasing scrutiny. It didn't happen overnight, but a shift had begun. A new idea was stirring, that learning could be inspired rather than imposed, and that the human mind was not just a vessel for obedience, but a source of dignity and potential. The earliest signs emerged with the rise of humanism in the 14th century. Italian scholar Francesco Petrarch, often considered the father of Renaissance humanism, rejected the sterile logic chopping of medieval education. Instead, he called for a return to classical sources, not to defend dogma, but to understand human nature, virtue, and moral responsibility. Petrarch saw value in the individual soul, and in doing so, planted the seeds for a new educational philosophy. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, figures like Desiderius Erasmus expanded this vision further. A former monk, Erasmus had experienced firsthand the harsh discipline of religious schools. In his writings, especially on the method of study and the education of a Christian prince, he criticized the brutal punishments used in classrooms. He argued that excessive fear destroyed a child's natural curiosity and love for learning. "Nothing is more inimical to studies," he wrote, "than fear." Erasmus wasn't alone. Across Europe, reformers and intellectuals began to question not just what was being taught, but how and why. Juan Luis Bibers, a Spanish scholar closely associated with Erasmus, advocated for gentler methods and approach. He emphasized observation, engagement, and the value of personal experience in education. He also recognized that children developed in stages, a radical idea in a society that had long viewed them as incomplete adults. These voices weren't merely philosophical. They began to influence practice. In northern Italy, humanist educators introduced new schools that emphasized literature, history, ethics, and rhetoric, modeled not on monastic obedience but on civic virtue and intellectual development. Latin was still taught, but now through conversation and context rather than punishment and fear. Grammar no longer stood alone. It was placed alongside poetry, moral philosophy, and even natural science. The shift was slow, and the old methods didn't disappear overnight. Floggings continued well into the 17th century, and many traditional schools resisted reform. But the cultural tide was turning. The notion that education should cultivate reason, morality, and self-awareness began to take root across Europe. The image of the child as a blank slate, shaped only by suffering, began to erode by the dawn of the Renaissance. Education was no longer solely a tool of control. It had begun, however cautiously, to become a path to human fulfillment. The brutality of medieval learning wasn't gone, but its legitimacy was being questioned for the first time. And in that moment, the modern idea of childhood was born. The medieval classroom may seem like a distant, alien world, a place of Latin recitations, whipping posts, and enforced silence. But its legacy is far closer than it appears. The methods, values, and assumptions born in those cold, echoing halls did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They evolved, persisted, and in many ways still shape how we educate today. Corporal punishment, once a cornerstone of medieval instruction, remained standard practice in European and American schools for centuries. In England, the cane was not formally banned in state schools until 1986. In France, physical discipline continued into the 19th century in institutions like the Petites. In parts of the United States, corporal punishment remains legal in public schools to this day, a direct descendant of the belief that pain instructs, that learning requires control. The basic structure of the classroom, desks in rows, a teacher at the front, strict schedules, a standardized curriculum, has its roots in medieval and early modern reforms that prioritized order over adaptability. Though the subjects and tools have changed, the underlying model often still mirrors the old hierarchy: the educator as enforcer, the student as subject. Even beyond discipline, the tension between control and curiosity continues to define modern education systems. Standardized testing, rigid curricula, and performance-based funding echo a model where obedience and uniformity matter more than independent thought. In many schools, critical inquiry is encouraged only within predefined boundaries. Just as medieval students recited what they were told without questioning the source, students today are often taught to memorize outcomes rather than explore ideas. But reformers have always emerged to challenge this cycle. Just as Erasmus and Vives called for humane treatment of children, modern educators like Maria Montessori, John Dewey, and Paulo Freire have argued that education should nurture creativity, empathy, and agency. The question of what education is for remains as relevant now as it was in the 15th century. When we look back at medieval education, we see more than dusty manuscripts and obsolete punishments. We see the long struggle between authority and imagination, between systems built to shape minds and systems built to control them. The past is not a mirror, but it is a map, and it shows us where these ideas began and how far they've come. The final legacy of medieval education is not just in the history of schools. It's in the assumptions that still go unquestioned. That obedience is a virtue. That learning must be earned through suffering. That order is more important than inspiration. So the question remains, what do we really want education to do? Is its purpose to raise thinkers or to manufacture compliance? The answer may depend on whether we choose to remember the past or repeat it in silence.